It's Revolutions Reconsidered. Welcome.
Look at
It's
the
not
cop.
Saturday night, it's Wednesday afternoon.
That's going to be
And
some copyright infringement, I think. On
what? I've never watched a show called Saturday Night Live. Welcome. We are here for Revolutions Reconsidered from Virginia. Both of us, different areas of Virginia. And we're here to talk about revolutions. Well, no, wait. We are Revolutions Reconsidered, and we're talking about Worlds Turned Upside Down, the podcast that unpacks we're the podcast that unpacks some of the sources, stories, and contributions that make up Worlds Turned Upside Down, which was started, invented, and written by Dr. James Ambuske,
Hello,
who is
Lynn.
joined with us today. Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing great. I like the idea of being the inventor of the podcast.
I know,
So,
right? Now you're an inventor too. You
exactly.
invented it, you wrote it, you created it, you brought it to life, you gave it life.
Yes, I am dressed in green, so it's a very sort of Wizard of Oz type wicked tie-in, I think, right now as well.
Pay no attention to the doctor behind the mask.
Exactly.
Yes. So today we're doing episode 8, and our episode is titled, that episode is titled The Trade. And it dives deeper into the story of British Atlantic trade in the era of the American Revolution and the remarkable lengths that historians go to reconstruct the past. So, this is kind of a perfect time to talk about this
Hmm.
because we all know we just had a holiday. And now all we're listening to is what we should buy and how we can be better friends and family members. And it all has to do with what material goods we purchase and give to our loved ones. And so, this is the time of year where it's all sales and ads. And basically, if you want to be happy, you have to spend lots of money,
That's
right?
right.
And so that's what we're in the middle of. But those items that we purchase and give, they make us, better people and they reflect our income, our culture, maybe our age, all sorts of things about us and the people we're giving them to. So that's the world we're in the middle of right now.
Hmm.
So now we're going to go back to the 1770s in the British North American colonies. So they also had a world of commercial goods, maybe not
Hmm.
exactly the same as today. So tell us about some of those goods and what they meant to all of the different people who were in those colonies.
Yeah, it's a great question, and in many ways, there's not much difference between us in a modern era in our infatuation with iPhones and different kinds of clothing and things like that, and folks in the 18th century, because they lived in many respects in a consumer economy like we do now, where they're buying manufactured goods that are coming from somewhere else, and that's kind of one of the central ideas behind the British Empire in the 18th century is that the colonies and the colonists as consumer. And so, folks are buying things that are manufactured in Great Britain. Perhaps they come from somewhere else far afield, like China or India, but they're being routed, finished and routed in England and Scotland and sent to North America where people buy them. And that, as you appropriately say, it reflects a range of values, right? It reflects a range of income. It reflects a range of culture. It reflects gender, and so over the course of the episode in Worlds Turned Upside Down, we tell the stories of various people who are engaged in this mercantile, this consumer economy, who are buying everything from, say, on the high end, right? A Virginia woman who buys a pair of cream-colored pumps in the 1770s, which is a statement both of her wealth and but also her desire to fit in with high Virginia society, all the way down to the scale of a woman named Suki, who also in Virginia in Campbell County in 1774, as an enslaved woman, walks into a store owned by a man named John Hook and buys some ribbon in a looking glass, what we would now call a mirror. And what does that have to tell us about her sensibility and her sense of self? Despite the status of her enslavement in the 18th century. And so we can use these kinds of objects that are both, as we say in the episode, both practical, farm tools,
Hmm.
things like that, but also refined, like a looking glass or like a pair of shoes that help individuals self fashion, as we would say, as historians often say, and make sense of the world that they live in and how they want to be presented to that world.
Right. It's so interesting that some of the items you could say are purely, aesthetic, or you can say, like now it's okay, I may need a car, but do I need the fanciest car
Right.
or do I just need the basic car? So a lot of that is sort of where you're coming from and just how interested you are in perhaps showing off certain aspects of yourself. So we're talking about the consumers. Now let's talk about sort of now the companies that are trying to sell us
Mhm.
all the goods. But back in the 1770s, where we're really talking about this plan of empire and Britain, and it sounds like they're looking to basically create an empire of commerce. So it's
Mhm.
all their control is all about money. It's all about trade. It's all about goods. So tell us a little bit about what these commercial items meant for them,
Right,
but
right.
also like what their ultimate goal was. Like, why is it so beneficial to sell all this stuff to the colonies?
Yeah, it's an important question. It's something that historians think a lot about. And so there's a term that we use that's called political economy, and it's
Hmm.
I bang my head against the wall trying to understand it myself because it is hard to understand. But essentially, it's the relationship between politics and economics, and how
Hmm.
that informs the decisions that political leaders make in an economic context. And so, when we think about the empire writ large, we have to think how our story is an evolution of what happens in the 1740s into the 1770s. Because, as we know, we've talked about on this show before, part of the American Revolution stems from the fact that the British have fought a gigantic war in the 1750s and 1760s against the French, the Spanish, and their indigenous allies. And what we have seen over the course of the 18th century is kind of a sea change in how the British think about themselves in relation to Europe and in relation to the empire.
Hmm.
In the early 18th century, they're really engaged with European affairs, really concerned with European trade. But as the course of the century goes on, and as a consequence of the Seven Years' War, the British think, all right, we have these colonies, we have these captive markets that are producing commodities like sugar and tobacco. We have these captive consumers who will then buy British made goods. So if we really focus on empire and kind of creating like a closed loop system in ways that we've kind of dreamed about but never been able to accomplish before, then not only does that bolster British manufacturers, right, but it much more importantly, it insulates, they think in their mind, British entanglements with Europe that will lead to future wars. I mean, they
Mm,
do think that future wars are coming. They don't think
right.
France is done. One of the things I think we'll talk about over the next few episodes is how much the resurgence of the French potentially scares the British. But
Hmm.
they think that though these colonies and these sort of captive markets are the key to British independence. And so if they are able to create a system where the colonies are dependent on the British, it will then necessitate and ensure the independence of the British in Europe and the empire writ large. So it's really important that Virginia tobacco planters are sending their tobacco across, and then in turn they're buying woolens made in Scottish textile mills. They're buying for their enslaved people, right? They're buying Osnaburg, which is made in those textile mills. They're buying China that is coming from China, but
Hmm.
maybe finished in England. Certainly silk that is finished in
Right.
England. That's a huge commodity for upper class colonists in the 18th century. And so they are trying from a big imperial level to create a perfect system that harmonizes all the constituent parts so that
Hmm.
everyone benefits. They're all attentive to the common imperial good,
Hmm.
and that it keeps people out of trouble in ways that they had not in the 18th century.
As much as possible, right? But still dependent,
Still
of
dependent,
course.
right?
Yes, on
Exactly.
the empire. So one thing I also want to ask is, I mean, today most of us, if not every single person,
Hmm.
when we buy these items, we usually use credit cards. You know,
Right.
we used to
Right.
use cash for things, and now a lot of people use credit cards, and they weren't using specie or
Right.
money back then. It was like credit, but it was
Hmm.
bartering. So can you just explain a little bit about how that worked and how they didn't
Yeah.
just pay money for something, but you were involved in this like very complicated process.
Yeah, this is a world built on credit. It's a world built on trust. So there's, as you say, there's very little specie. There's very little coins
Hmm.
in the colonies in this period, and that's for a few reasons. One, the physical act of mining. Parliament prohibits the colonies from having their own mints, but also oftentimes Parliament requires any taxes to be paid, customs duties and whatnot to be paid in
Hmm.
specie. So there's like a net drain that's flowing out of the colonies by the 1760s. So credit is really the way that this world works, and that, as I said, that credit is built on trust. And so if you're a Virginia tobacco planter, what you would do is you would harvest your crop, or your enslaved people would harvest your crop. They would pack it up and put it on a ship and send it to London. That that tobacco gets sold on consignment, and then your agents over there purchase things on your behalf, and the merchants on both sides of the Atlantic are recording debits and credits in a ledger. And as long as you continue to be a trustworthy customer, as long as you are paying something towards your debt when those debts are called in, and as long as the economic conditions are favorable, then merchants are entirely happy to lend you credit and to sell you things on credit. So it's a very common thing. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually more unusual to buy things using specie
Mm-hmm.
than than on credit. And we can also think of credit too in the form of the paper currency that some of the colonies do issue in the
Right.
1750s before they're kind of told not to do that in the 1760s. All those bills of exchange, that paper money, today we think of that almost as a kind of equivalence to a coin, right? But in this period, it's not. It's basically an IOU that says, I'm good for it, and interest rates might fluctuate, the currency
Mm-hmm.
might become devalued or overvalued, but at the end of the day, it is kind of like a debit and credit transaction.
Yeah, that's so it feels so relevant because it sounds a lot like
Exactly.
credit cards, and
Yep.
then with our dollars, the worth of it fluctuates
Right.
in the global market. So this it sounds like a very familiar story
Yeah, and these people are,
here.
I mean, they're subject to interest rates too, right?
Mm-hmm.
If depending on how much specie is present in any given part, the Bank of England or, its equivalent in the 18th century is raising or lowering rates, and
Mm-hmm.
the market is determining rates, determining insurance rates. One of the fun things we get into this in the episode is how the insurance market works.
Right.
Dr. Hannah Farber talks a lot about that, and is probably the only person I've ever encountered who writes about insurance in a hilarious way, and so like we have to have her on the show.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, it fluctuates, and they have to make adjustments accordingly.
Right. See, it's so fascinating. And one of my favorite things about this episode is that we get to talk about people who you don't read about in history
Right.
books, who you're
Uh-huh.
not going to come across in, your textbook or even most monographs.
Right.
And so we do have a bonus audio, which is
Yes.
fantastic with by Dr. Hannah Knox Tucker.
Hmm.
And she talks about the amazing lengths that she went to reconstruct this world that we're talking about of shipping and trade. So,
Hmm.
do you want to introduce? Do you have anything you
Yeah.
want to say to introduce it?
Yeah, Dr. Hannah Knox Tucker is at the Copenhagen School of Business. She's a historian of the 18th century and of the economics of the 18th century. And what we have here for you today is Hannah talking about how she went and constructed a database of something like 30,000 entries spanning from 1698 to 1766, recording economic transactions on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly shipping records, because she is a historian of the market, and particularly how ship captains were instrumental in negotiating trade deals in the 18th century. So, if you think that it's hard enough to work with letters, um, I promise you, and as somebody who does not do economic history, but has to do it when it's necessary to our podcast or to my own work, right? Um, Shipping records can be maddening. Uh, Account books can be maddening, and so imagine the spreadsheet from hell, and that's what Hannah built to do this amazing work. And so, let's hear her talk about it now.
Perfect. And here we go.
I constructed this database of about 30,000 entries and clearances from the ports in colonial Virginia from 1698 to 1766 using the Naval Office shipping lists from the National Archives at Kew. And this data has a lot of information about vessels because it was derived from a kind of imperial effort to make sure ships are abiding by the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts are this really influential piece of mercantilist policy that basically require ships to be British, captains to be British, and certain goods to flow directly through British ports before being re exported to European ports. So it's a really big piece of imperial policy. And to make sure that people are actually doing what Navigation Acts require, The British government appoints naval officers to collect data about ships in ports all over the Atlantic world. The naval officers create these gigantic sheets filled with information about the vessels, including their date of arrival and departure, the name of the vessel, the tonnage, so how big the vessel is, information about the size of the crew, its path throughout the Atlantic world. So it'll say where the ship is coming from or where it plans to go to. And it will also have kind of information about the cargo itself. So in order to make sure that enumerated commodities, goods like tobacco and sugar and cotton, are flowing through Britain before they're re-exported, the naval officers are actually collecting information about how much of these commodities are being shipped on these particular vessels.
Gosh, that sounds amazing. I mean, as a historian, I was drooling a little bit because I'm thinking, oh my goodness, the things that you could learn from this, which obviously
Right.
she did. And one of the things that or a lot of the things she came up with were these stories of these people that their stories are nowhere else. Like they're in,
Right.
their full stories are in here. And so,
Well, one of the great things about the administrative state, which is like a phrase that often puts people immediately to sleep, is that it keeps this keeps these enormous amount of records, right? And
mhm,
the work that Hannah was doing is reflective of the fact of the kind of empire that the British are trying to build, and
right,
that requires an enormous amount of data, both to sort of see how the economy is working, how it's not working, but also to ensure that people are obeying the rules. And so
right,
you've got these naval officers, these customs officers checking cargoes and figuring out, where ships are departing from, what they're carrying, whether or not they've paid their duties and stuff like that. But as you say, right, then you could begin to think about, all right, who's actually on those ships or
right.
who's buying those goods. And even if, we have the name of one individual, that isn't the totality of people who are participating in this whole economic system. So they can tell us a lot about, who people were, or at least give us some hint or impressions that we can then begin to unpack.
Right. And I love that. I mean, I've done a lot of work on, enslaved people and
Hmm.
colonization and who, went over to Liberia. And every little bit of information is just, it's one individual, but it's more than we had before.
Right, right, right.
And so Dr. Tucker, she has some really great stories from these amazing 30,000 records that she went through. So if you want to share
Yeah.
maybe one or two or your favorite, I know you mentioned Martha Goosley,
Yeah, one of
and want to tell
one,
us her story?
yeah, one of the stories that Hannah Knox Tucker told us during the course of our interview with her for the series is about a woman named Martha Goosley, who lived in York, Virginia in the 1770s. And she was the mother of a ship captain named William Goosley, who traded out of the York and the James Rivers in Virginia to Great Britain in this period. And what we came to learn from talking with Dr. Tucker is that Martha Goosley acted essentially as her son's hype woman. She, because one of the things that Hannah makes clear in her work is that a captain's reputation was essential to him being able to do business. And
Makes
what
sense.
Martha Goosley does is she writes to all these different merchants in basically pumping her son's reputation, saying this is a trustworthy guy. Like he really he can get the job done. And actually, I've got one of the letters that Martha writes to a merchant named John Norton
Okay.
in August of 1770. And so you can actually, if you go on the John D. Rockefeller Library's digital collection site, you can read some of the letters from Martha Goosley. And so she's writing August 8th, 1770, to, as I said, John Norton, who is a
Mm-hmm.
merchant in England. And she's writing in York, Virginia, which along the York River down here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what she's talking about in part is expectations for the or for the tobacco crop this year, how exciting it's probably going to be, and it's going to be great. But then she talks about her son, and she says, "My son was very happy in getting rid of his troublesome cargo. Altogether, he was so lucky as to have them peaceable, but hope he will never engage with such another freight. He has now got a pretty general acquaintance, and doubt not, with your kind assistance, he will be able to load a larger ship if you choose to send one, and sooner in this river, this being the York River, than the James River." So she's saying, listen, He's gotten past his troubles. He's dealt with the troublesome cargo. He's now back in business. If you send that ship to this river, to the York River, by God, he is going to make you rich beyond belief. And so she writes these letters to these various merchants saying, my son's got it going on, and you should do business with him. And so, we would know about somebody like William, right? Because he's a
Right.
ship captain. He's showing up in records all the time. But then by virtue of looking at William, we get to Martha, and you can see how women like her are playing instrumental roles in the colonial economy. In this case, as we said, she's kind of the hype woman for her son. If you look at somebody like Elizabeth Greenleaf in Boston, she's a merchant in her own right. She's, out on Union Street. She's selling seeds that she's imported from Britain, and you can see that evidence in the newspapers and whatnot. So you begin to pull back these layers from these different kinds of economic sources, and you've got all these kinds of people who are engaging in this mercantile economy, and you get a better sense of the not only economic realities of this period, but what people's lives were like and what they were doing, and it's really fun.
It really is. And it's like he had his own like little PR firm there,
Yeah,
and his mother was going around and saying, and who knows, maybe somebody trusted him because they got that letter versus someone they didn't really know anything about,
yeah,
you know?
exactly.
So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
got to give mom some credit there.
yeah. Well, I mean, and think about it, right? I mean, in any industry, but particularly let's inside baseball, like the academic world,
Hmm.
I'm more liable to work with someone because I know from somebody else that they have a good reputation for being, a
Absolutely.
good person and a good scholar than I am somebody who has less of a stellar reputation. And so that is a social currency that is very much still with us today, and and probably will be in perpetuity.
Oh, that's so fantastic. And I think we both instinctively know the answer to this, but I always like to ask this because it gives us a chance to
Hmm.
explain why what we do is so awesome.
Yeah.
But why are these stories?
Hmm.
Why are the stories, of Martha or all these individuals that we're finding, why are they so important to the
Right.
bigger story? And important for us to know, to understand, and sort of, tie into what we do read all the time, in
Right.
school textbooks and sort of the known narrative. So
Yeah.
explain that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one thing for me to sit down and say, okay, here's how the transatlantic economy works. There's, debits and credits. There's commodities from Virginia going to agents in Liverpool or London or Bristol, and then manufacturers from Birmingham or Manchester or Glasgow coming back across the Atlantic. But I think as we got at with Martha or with Suki, the enslaved woman we talked about, we had to have a better understanding of how this actually works. And so, yes, we need to read Adam Smith, who's thinking deeply about these issues in Glasgow in the 1760s. As he's preparing to write The Wealth of Nations, which is a reflection of his understanding of the economy in this period. But it's the people who make this economy work, and so you've got the imperial economic ideal, but then how does that clash or harmonize with reality? And it's the people on the ground that are doing it, and it's not just John Hancock, or it's not Paul Revere, or it's not George Washington. It's people like Martha Gooseley. It's people like Elizabeth Greenleaf. People like John Hook, the backcountry Virginia store merchant from whom Suki buys that ribbon and looking glass. And so
Right.
those those are, I think, the devil. It's not the devil because the devil's not present here. But the devil is in the details, right?
Right.
I don't know how I was trying to work my way out of that one, but it failed. Uh, but those marvelous details kind of give us a concrete idea of the lived experience and the everyday reality of people in 18th century British America.
Absolutely. And I think most people who, listen to us and who study history are those on the ground people,
Yeah.
would have been those on the ground people
Right.
in the story of history, and maybe in several hundred years when they're looking at, presidential administrations and policies and
Yeah.
foreign relations. What about us? What were
Right.
we doing at that time?
Well, I would have been a great lord in the Highlands of Scotland. I don't know. Kidding.
We have no doubt. We have no doubt you would have
Exactly.
been a great lord. Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely. Whereas me, I'm like, I'd have been that, person shuffling down the street, just, maybe buying a looking glass or whatnot.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's why I'm interested in my people.
Well, it's
You
it's
know,
fun, right? Because we often think, that kind of counterfactual. We all play with ourselves, like, well, if I had lived in that period, I wouldn't have done that. Well, you can't know that, and so
exactly.
let's spend some time understanding what people did and why, as
Right.
opposed to uh, worrying about what you would have done, because it's the
Right.
past is interesting enough.
Oh, so true. And once and learning their motivations gives you
Yeah.
more insight into their everyday lives, like what motivations push them to make their choices,
Yep.
and why are those so important.
Right.
Whereas today we have likely have very different
Yep.
motivations for everything 'cause it's a different world.
Yep. Yep.
And of course I felt that I would be completely lax if we didn't talk a little bit more about tobacco,
Yes.
because we're both in Virginia right now,
Right.
so heaven forbid we don't talk more about tobacco. So,
Tobacco.
did anything change with tobacco? I mean, we know tobacco's, well, cotton is king. I'm not sure what tobacco is. Lord,
Exactly.
Prince. Uh, so, tobacco's been important for quite a while.
Right.
But does this new empire of commerce change
Hmm.
anything with tobacco, and also how that ties into slavery?
Yeah.
Because of course, tobacco, that's backbreaking work,
Yep. Yep.
and who's doing that in the South? So,
Yeah, well, I mean, in the 18th century, well, before the Revolution, certainly, tobacco is king in the mainland, right? Sugar is king in the
mhm.
Caribbean, but
Right,
but
right.
tobacco is really an interesting case because we know right from the colonial era that it makes Virginia possible. It saves Virginia
Mhm.
as a viable colony in the early 17th century. But by the and tobacco is still hugely important by the period we're talking about in the mid 18th century, 1760s. Although a lot of folks are beginning to shift to wheat as tobacco is wearing out the soil.
Right.
But what's fascinating about this period is the way that the larger economic picture begins to change, because by the 1750s, the Scots have taken control of the tobacco trade.
Oh,
Particularly, so if you go to Glasgow today, there's a reason why there's a Virginia Street, and it's because a lot of the tobacco merchants who were dominating that trade had their merchant
oh
houses there.
wow.
Yeah, so what the Scots are doing is they're not really worried about big, gigantic planters like George Washington, because Washington tends to sell his tobacco directly through an agent
Right.
in England. But what small planters like a Patrick Henry will do is they will sell their tobacco on consignment to a Scottish merchant who has set up a store on behalf of a company in Glasgow, somewhere along the Riverine regions in Virginia.
Hmm.
And so, what the Scots begin to do is set up these stores where they can become sort of the focal point for these small planters, capture that market, engaging in that credit and debit system that we've been talking about,
Right.
and in shipping the tobacco back to Glasgow. And Glasgow is really advantageous because of where it is in Great Britain. It's on the west coast of Scotland along the River
Right.
Clyde, and so ships coming out of there can immediately drop down on the currents and sail right across to North America into the kind of Charleston and then up to the Chesapeake where they can operate. And so they have a distinct advantage in that regard over Liverpool
Mm-hmm.
and other English tobacco ports. So by the 1770s they are in control of this thing,
Oh
and it's
wow.
making them enormous sums of money. Not as much as they're making in the Caribbean on sugar, but
Mm-hmm.
they're making tons of money.
Right.
And so how that relates to slavery is really important as well, because you see the kind of bifurcation beginning in this period between enslaved labor in the Caribbean and in the mainland in terms of to put it crudely, the supply of enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
We know in places like Jamaica and Antigua, the horrific conditions of sugar work
Oh yeah.
necessitate the continued importation of enslaved people from West Africa, because the brutality of that work kills people very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's millions of people who are being sent to the Caribbean, whereas in the mainland, in the early 18th century, there is still a significant importation of people via the transatlantic slave trade, but that is shifting by the mid to late 18th century, because populations in Virginia and Maryland are self-reproducing at this point.
Right.
So you begin to see less of a reliance of Virginians and Marylanders on on that trade. That's not to say they're not still buying people. Washington himself in the 1750s goes to Maryland and buys some enslaved people, directly off of a boat that's come in from West Africa. But there is a less of a reliance. And what that's going to do, to kind of give you a spoiler or a preview of what's going to happen down the road, is that, for example, in 1772, when the Virginians are trying to, ban or essentially take themselves out of the transatlantic slave trade, it's
Right.
less for moral reasons. It's because if they can get themselves out of that trade, the the prices of their enslaved people that are naturally reproducing will go up. And so
Exactly.
the slave trade is this transatlantic slave trade is depressing the price of enslaved people. If they get themselves out of it, then that is economically better for them. Doesn't mean that there aren't people who want to get out of it for moral reasons too. Certainly there are, but from the larger economic standpoint, that's what's beginning to happen.
Right. You're going from the international to the domestic
Right,
slave trade,
right, right.
essentially, which will probably be discussed in a later
Yeah,
episode. But
yeah,
just as important in sort of the change of what's going on at
right,
this time period.
right, right.
Yeah. So, um, so my last question I sort of grappled with because obviously the whole point of this entire series, is revolutions.
Right.
But I have to say, and maybe it's just because what I study and where I come from,
Hmm?
this is the episode where I kept thinking, oh, okay, that's where that's going to lead to this, and oh,
Right,
that's
right.
going to lead to it started to like really, really obviously tie in
Yeah,
to what the colonists North America start, getting upset about and leading to this revolution.
yeah.
So do you think this, idea of a commercial empire is sort of laying a foundation, or is it taking a foundation already built and start like rapidly building the house, or
Hmm.
what is its place in sort of pushing the colonies toward the eventual break?
Yeah, I think it's helping to create the conditions for a potential for a break with Britain, in part because everybody agrees that commerce is essential.
Hmm.
Not everyone agrees on the terms of that commercial enterprise, and so what the British are worried about is creating this closed loop system to preserve Britain's independence, and that's going to lead them, as we'll talk about in a couple episodes from now, to begin to formulate things like the Sugar Act of 1764 or the Stamp Act of
Hmm.
1765 or the Townshend Duties of 1767. How can we leverage the economic strength of this empire, impose some moderate taxation on the colonies to help administer and defend this empire in ways that will be not necessarily heavily burdensome, but they're going to notice it. But at the end of the day, we've racked up huge debt to win this war, to preserve this empire, to create the conditions for an imperial common good.
Hmm.
The British Americans, they have to kick in something too.
Right.
And of course, that's where, if we talked about political economy, right?
Hmm.
Though some of those economic problems are going to create the political conditions or the political basis for disputes about Parliament's authority and Parliament's sovereignty. And so we'll see later on, right? British Americans like John Dickinson, who I know that you and Isaac just talked to
We did.
about on Too Complicated for History,
Hmm.
he'll say, there is no distinction between external and internal taxations. A customs duty on paper, paint, lead glass, and tea is an affront to our rights as British subjects because
Right.
we do not have representation in Parliament. And the Pandora's box that opens, those questions about Parliament sovereignty, partly tied to the economic conditions of the empire, reveal significant misalignments between what Britons in Britain think the empire is and what British Americans think the empire is, and whether or not those can be reconciled, well, you'll just have to find out.
Oh gosh, you're just leaving us on the edge of our seats, and it's so exciting. Now we're getting to you're getting to my language
Yeah,
now.
yeah,
All the acts, all the anger. Yeah.
right, yeah, yeah, yeah,
So it's just gonna get better, guys. So
yeah.
keep watching. Thanks so much, Jim, for being here with us. Of course, we'll do our little things that you have to remember. So Jim mentioned, Too Complicated for History. I'm a co-host with Isaac Loftus, so please check us out. And if you'd like to help support us, we have our Primary Source Media Patreons. You can head over there. We have different levels. You can start out free, different benefits for other levels, and as always, check out our social media. And also, Jim has lots of good things to talk about over at R2.
Yeah, r2studios.org. You can check out Worlds Turned Upside Down, Your Most Obedient and Humble Servant, and coming very soon, Finding Jane Austen. And so we're going
Oh,
to dig into the real life of the woman who has created a cultural zeitgeist of her own.
and she was interesting. That's going to be
Oh,
good.
yes. And a little bit of a revolutionary tidbit. In December 1775, her father, who was a minister, prayed for the defeat of the rebels in North America. So
Ooh, and what will happen? You'll have to tune in and see.
tune in and see.
Thanks so much, Jim. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lynn.
And we'll be back in 2 Wednesdays, not next Wednesday, the Wednesday after at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time with another Revolutions Reconsidered talking about episode 9. So hurry up and go over to Worlds and listen to the next episode and then meet us here in 2 weeks.
See you soon.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Yay! That was awesome, Jim.
That was great. Thank you. I, you know,
Woohoo!
I